Every enterprise has a strategy. Every leader has a plan. But when the ground shifts, it is architecture that decides what holds. Resilience is not a reaction, it is a design. It is built into how your organization moves, prioritizes, and protects long before disruption arrives. Hi, I'm Mirza Chughtai, and this is part 5 of the long arc, Resilience through Architecture. This series explores the unseen disciplines that turn ambition into legacy and change into impact. Today, we explore one of the most misunderstood levers in modern business, enterprise architecture, often seen as a technical domain buried in diagrams, standards, and roadmaps. But in reality, it is something much more. Architecture is a leadership system. It is a moral framework. It is how values scale and how decisions hold. In every transformation, I've had the privilege to lead, advise, or recover. The critical question was never just about tools, headcount, or funding. It was this: can the architecture behind the ambition carry the load and adapt when the terrain shifts? Because when disruption hits, it is not your vision or velocity that is tested. It is your system's ability to flex, absorb, and still deliver outcomes. In today's episode, we'll explore 3 architectural disciplines that enable this kind of resilience, not just as an idea, but as an operating advantage. Because resilience is a design principle. It is not something you bolt on after a disruption. It is something you build upstream into the very architecture of how your enterprise functions. The strongest organizations I've seen do not wait for volatility to reveal what matters. They codify what matters intentionally, proactively, and structurally. And they do it by elevating architecture from a technical artifact to a more strategic discipline, a moral compass, a coordination layer that links vision to execution with integrity intact. Because when pressure rises, it is not the backlog, the brand book, or the board deck that holds. It is resilient architecture. Architecture that carries decisions, that protects values, that enables speed without compromising identity or ethics. And when we build it with rigor, foresight, and structure, we create more than scalable systems. We create adaptive ones. In today's episode, I'll walk you through 3 architectural disciplines that I have field tested across regulated industries, critical infrastructure, and global transformations. Discipline 1: make architecture a leadership language, where we elevate architecture from the back room to the boardroom, where decisions about systems, trade offs, and boundaries shape the organization's future. Discipline 2: architect for adaptability, anchor architecture to operating rhythm, where we design systems that can evolve, not just survive, when environments change. And we make architecture real through rituals, reviews, and decision loops that keep it alive in motion and not frozen in design. And finally, discipline three, build for interoperability at scale, where we ensure the platforms, teams, and functions are not just integrated, but composable, discoverable, and resilient under pressure. These are not philosophies, they are operating disciplines, and they are how architecture becomes the carrier of resilience, not just performance. So let's begin. Discipline 1, make architecture a leadership language, not a diagram, not a siloed function, but a leadership language that connects vision with velocity. Because when architecture lives only in the back room, it becomes reactive. But when it is elevated to the boardroom, it becomes transformative. When the board defines ambition, architecture shapes its feasibility. When executives outline strategy, architecture determines its scalability. When transformation demands clarity, architecture becomes the coordination layer. Yet, in many organizations, architecture is discussed only in technical terms, distant from the rooms where strategic bets are placed. And so, fragmentation seeps in, not because people lack intelligence, but because the enterprise lacks a common architectural grammar. I've seen the cost of that disconnection, and I've seen what happens when we close that gap. At a global healthcare and life sciences organization, I had the privilege of supporting a transformation effort where the stakes were high: digital acceleration, life saving outcomes, and regulatory integrity. We re architected their infrastructure: cloud, edge, on prem, not just for modernization, but for resilience with purpose. We implemented a fault tolerant cloud agnostic design, embedded governance and observability from day one, real time failover simulations that reduced recovery time objectives by 70%, a clean separation between architecture engineering and technology operations. But here was the unlock: we created a certification framework. Every hardware, platform, software release, or patch had to be certified in a replica of production and earn a certificate of readiness before deployment. A defined pass fail rubric was non negotiable, and it became a prerequisite for architectural and change approval. This was more than technical assurance. It created clarity of accountability, it ensured compliance without delay, it gave the board a real mechanism to introduce and enforce new policies around ethics, security, and compliance. And it enabled the seamless incorporation of new regulatory requirements, allowing risk teams to assess business impact before exposure occurred. That is architecture as governance, not in theory, but in motion. Resilience is not just about surviving failure. It is about designing for change upstream. When architecture becomes a shared language across the boardroom, the command center, and the build floor, you gain more than just alignment. You gain adaptability at scale. Let's now explore discipline 2. Architect for adaptability, anchor architecture to operating rhythm. Resilience is built in the lab, but tested in production. It is not enough to design for today's systems. We must design for tomorrow's change. Because in a world of shifting conditions, high regulatory scrutiny, and multi speed innovation, the true test of architecture is not just elegance, it is adaptability. The strongest organizations I've seen do three things really well. They increase their internal rate of innovation without introducing risk. They integrate emerging technologies with incumbent platforms without rework or drift. And they de risk strategic execution by designing for change before it arrives. That was the exact mandate behind a supercloud transformation I had the privilege to support at a Fortune Global 300 financial institution. This multi-year transformation redefined how the enterprise operated at scale. Our mission was to design and implement a supercloud architecture, a unified orchestration layer that spanned hybrid multi-cloud environments across bare metal, infrastructure as service, and platform as service, across internal clouds and external clouds, and across SaaS and co-location data centers. The key technology artifacts included transitioning to infrastructure as code for compute, storage, and networking, and policy as code to codify cybersecurity and regulatory controls. And we also had to build unified control planes and data planes to enable seamless provisioning, observability, and workload governance. This was not technical unification. It was architectural alignment. The real challenge? To offer developer experience and operational agility at par with hyperscale providers. Because we had to preserve the strengths and governance of internal systems and intentionally avoid building functionality that was better suited for external cloud providers. Because developer friction is not just a delivery problem. If not done right, it is a business drag. We had to balance greenfield innovation with brownfield realities, navigate intense regulatory scrutiny, including matters requiring attention MRAs, harmonize run the shop and change the shop imperatives, and enable workload mobility across environments based on cost, performance, and policy. This was adaptive innovation by design, engineered across all 7 layers of the OSI model. And to sustain that motion, architecture had to anchor the daily operating rhythm. It shaped where workloads should land and why, how performance, security, and compliance guarantees one codified, and what feedback loops ensured architecture evolved without fragility. Architecture became the operational brain, dynamically aligning service level expectations with business unit priorities. This was not just a cloud transformation. It was a rehearsal for how the enterprise would face every future inflection point. Because adaptability is not about flexibility alone. It is about resilience in motion. And here's the last discipline. Discipline 3, build for interoperability at scale. In today's enterprise, complexity is not the exception. It is the baseline. Multiple ecosystems, competing platforms, tools sprawl across every domain. And while most native tools integrate well within their own ecosystems, integration across ecosystems is where resilience is either gained or lost. Because the challenge is not just building for today's needs, it is designing systems that are composable across silos, discoverable under pressure, and governable at scale. That was the core challenge at a global financial institution where I had the privilege of helping orchestrate a top to bottom modernization effort. Their mandate was clear: no compromise on compliance, no visibility gaps, no cybersecurity vulnerabilities, but also no more tech refresh cycles that yield the same constraints in a new form. This was not modernization for its own sake, it was a quantum leap, a redesign of how the enterprise functioned. They shifted from workloads running directly on bare metal to cloud native containerized orchestration, from underutilized physical infrastructure to software defined everything, from build everything to a buy then build strategy, so the enterprise could move faster, scale smarter, and rely on clear roadmaps and commercial grade support. But none of it could come at the expense of regulatory compliance like Sarbanes-Oxley, FINRA, matters requiring attention MRAs. We also could not sacrifice on cybersecurity posture or enterprise visibility. So we codified a design philosophy that became central to this transformation. Composability and immutability were no longer ideals. They became design requirements. Every architectural decision had to justify itself against these principles. Any exception required special approval and was flagged on a hot list for modernization. New regulatory requirements could be layered directly into existing frameworks, and risk posture could be projected before impact. This changed the posture of the entire enterprise. Observability, security, incident and events management, and application performance monitoring were the functions that were chosen to be centralized. Every system had to provide logs, metrics, and traces in real time. Decentralized innovation was preserved, but without losing centralized policy enforcement, governance, or compliance. Resilience was not just engineered, it was enforced. We ensured the architecture could evolve without rewiring the foundation every time we added a new application, a new data center, a new business unit, or a new technology stack. And that is the essence of interoperability at scale. Knowing what must remain centralized, knowing what can be made composable, and knowing when to orchestrate, automate, or abstract to maximize effectiveness. Because when systems are interoperable, innovation becomes scalable. And when governance is embedded, transformation becomes sustainable. We often think of resilience as a response. But in the strongest organizations I have seen, resilience is not a response, it is a design. not just for uptime or continuity, but for integrity under pressure, clarity in complexity, and adaptability at scale. Because when the world shifts, the roadmap may guide, the message may inspire, but it is the resilient architecture that makes them coherent under pressure. Architecture that embeds what the business values into how the business moves. Architecture that translates leadership intent into execution that can evolve without losing its soul. An architecture that protects what must never be compromised, even as everything else transforms. The organizations that will lead through this next era are the ones with the clearest resilient architecture built on these three disciplines. Make architecture a leadership language, so vision can become execution without translation loss. Anchor architecture to operating rhythm, so innovation is sustained without fragility. Build for interoperability at scale, so complexity does not become a constraint. These are not technical aspirations, they are leadership commitments that gives your teams the clarity to move, your systems the integrity to scale, and your strategy the ability to adapt without compromise. I'm Mirza Chughtai. This was part 5 of the long arc, Resilience through Architecture. If this resonated with you, I invite you to explore the full series, The Long Arc Transformation That Sticks. Each part unpacks the field-tested disciplines that help leaders architect change that lasts not just technically, but operationally, culturally, and strategically. And if this episode spoke to your experience, please share it. Start a dialogue. Because the conversations we have today will shape the systems we lead tomorrow. Thank you for watching. I'm Mirza Chughtai, and this is The Long Arc.